It was a night when silence pressed so heavy it seemed to choke the breath from my chest. I was only 18, my body trembling in the shadows of a broken farmhouse, and every sound beyond the wooden walls felt like the last echo before death. For years I had been told what the Americans would do if they found me. They would drag me into the dirt, tear me apart, and laugh while I begged for mercy. I clutched the cold metal of the grenade in my hand, my only promise of escape, and whispered a prayer that my shame might end quickly. The others huddled close, their faces pale ghosts in the dim light, each of us believing we would not see another sunrise. Then the footsteps came, heavy boots against the earth, steady, drawing closer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I expected shouting, gunfire, the rough hands of men. But instead there was a pause, a voice calling out in a language I barely understood, softened through the mouth of an interpreter. "Come out. We will not hurt you." I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream at the lie. My whole life
Here are
had been
some other
warnings
women
of
who are
beasts,
also
of
learning.
monsters disguised as men. And yet when I stepped outside, it was not claws or teeth that greeted me. It was distance. It was respect. One soldier lowered his weapon, another removed his helmet, and for a moment the world tilted on its axis. The air carried no violence, only a stillness so strange it felt like a dream. My throat tightened, my eyes stung, because in that instant I understood that everything I had believed, everything I had feared, might have been nothing more than chains forged from lies. And the first crack of light entered the darkness I had carried all my life. The night I first saw them, the Americans who did not touch me, I felt the ground shift beneath everything I had ever believed. That moment stayed in my chest like a wound that would not close, because it forced me to look back on the years that shaped me into a creature of fear, a girl who thought death itself was softer than the touch of an enemy. To understand what happened that night, you must understand the shadows I grew up in, the voices that shaped my childhood into a cage. I was born into a world where the Americans were never people. They were monsters in human skin, demons who would tear us limb from limb, who would defile our bodies and devour our children. This was not told once, not whispered as rumor. It was carved into us like scripture, repeated by teachers, by soldiers, by the trembling lips of neighbors who themselves had been taught the same lies. I remember the first time I saw the drawings in school. I could not have been older than 7. The teacher held up a poster printed by the Ministry of Information. On it, American soldiers laughed as they bayoneted infants, their rifles dripping with blood, their teeth bared like wolves. One child raised his hand and asked if the pictures were true. The teacher's face hardened, and she slammed the ruler against the desk. "This is the truth you must never forget. They will come for us all." I swallowed those words like bitter medicine, believing every line of ink, every smear of red. In the quiet of the night, when the wind rattled our thin walls, I sometimes thought I could already hear them coming. As the war stretched on, the lessons grew harsher. We were taught not only that capture was worse than death, but how to make death ourselves. I remember sitting cross-legged on the cold wooden floor as a military officer came into our classroom. He showed us how to hold a kitchen knife, how to aim it at our throats or bellies if the Americans breached our homes. He showed mothers how to press pillows over their babies' faces to smother them before the enemy could arrive. At 8 years old, I watched women in the village nod silently, tears streaming down their cheeks, as if agreeing to a contract with despair. Childhood should have been laughter and play, but mine was filled with rehearsals for endings. By the time I turned 15, the war had swallowed everything. Food was scarce, neighbors disappeared, and whispers ran through the village that girls were being taken to serve the army. They said it was for nursing, to tend to the wounded, to help the empire. My father, worn down by hunger and desperation, signed the papers that sent me away. I remember his eyes, hollow with shame, as he avoided my gaze. My mother held me tightly that night, her breath hot against my ear as she whispered, "Do what they say. Stay alive." She did not know where I was going, and neither did I. When I arrived, I learned the truth. It was not nursing, it was not tending to the broken. It was being broken myself, over and over, until I thought I no longer existed. They called us comfort women, a word twisted into something soft, but nothing about it was soft. It was jagged, violent, endless. Some nights, I closed my eyes and prayed the bombs would fall closer. that fire from the sky would put an end to the torment. And through it all, the warnings about the Americans never stopped. Officers reminded us constantly that should we ever fall into enemy hands, the horror would be beyond imagination. They told us the Americans would use us until we were nothing but shells, then cast us aside like rotting meat. To seal their command, each of us was given a single grenade. The order was clear. If capture was near, we were to pull the pin. I kept that grenade tucked under the thin blanket at night, its weight pressing against my ribs as if reminding me that escape was only one movement away. Sometimes, I held it tightly in my palm, imagining the warmth of the metal exploding into silence, imagining the relief of knowing no man would ever touch me again. Death was not a terror to me then. It was a mercy waiting patiently at my side. The thought that Americans might come, that they might lay their hands on me, was worse than the grave. The lies had worked their way into my bones so deeply that even as I suffered beneath the cruelty of my own army, I clung to the belief that the enemy was worse. There was no corner of life untouched by this poison. Even the youngest children played games where they pretended to leap from cliffs, shouting "Banzai," before falling into piles of leaves, mimicking the suicides we were told were noble. Mothers taught their daughters that their bodies belonged first to the emperor, second to their husbands, and never to themselves. And always, always, the shadow of the Americans loomed over us as the ultimate terror. When news of Pearl Harbor was spoken, I was too young to understand, but I remember the adults' faces. They told us the war would be swift, that Japan would triumph. Yet as the years bled out and the bombs fell closer, their voices grew tighter, their eyes darted with doubt. But even then, no one questioned the story of the Americans as beasts. It was the one thing we all agreed upon. By the time the empire began to crumble, I no longer recognized myself. I had become one of thousands of girls used and discarded, carrying bruises that never faded and a silence that screamed inside me. And yet, the fear of Americans remained stronger than the hatred I felt toward the men who hurt me daily. That fear was cultivated carefully, watered by propaganda, fertilized by the despair of a nation that preferred we die than be seen by the enemy. It was the fear that had me gripping the grenade so tightly the night the footsteps came. Looking back now, I see how complete the darkness was. They had taken not only my body, but my understanding of the world. They had stolen the innocence of children, teaching us to greet strangers not with curiosity, but with knives. They had convinced us that surrender was shame, that mercy did not exist, that our only honor was to vanish into the earth before an American hand could touch us. It was a lie so total that I did not even think of questioning it. I carried it as truth, as unshakable as the seasons, as permanent as the mountains. So when I tell you about that night, when the soldiers came and I expected the end, understand this. I was not simply afraid of men with guns. I was afraid of a story woven into me from birth, a story that painted them as devils and me as prey. And I believed it with every trembling breath. That is why the silence that greeted me, the distance, the respect in their eyes, tore through me so deeply. It was not only my body that was spared. It was my entire world unraveling, thread by thread, as I began to realize that the enemy I had been taught to fear all my life was not the monster. The monster had been the lie itself. The memory of that night will never leave me, because it was the moment when the world I had carried inside me collapsed and a new one, fragile and uncertain, began to take shape. After the weeks of bombardment and the endless sound of retreating Japanese soldiers, silence fell over our part of the island. That silence was not peace. It was the breath. Before something final, and for those of us left behind, it was the sound of abandonment. The soldiers had fled north, dragging their weapons and their orders, leaving us women with nothing but a single grenade and the command to use it. Better to vanish in fire than to be taken alive, they had said. I clutched that grenade so tightly my fingers ached, as though its cold weight was the only thing anchoring me to the earth. There were 6 of us in that house, the walls cracked, the roof half caved in from shelling. We huddled in the dark like children hiding from a storm, though we were no longer children, not after what we had lived through. The others whispered prayers into the damp air, their voices trembling. I could hear the quiver of their breath, smell the sourness of fear rising from our bodies. None of us dared speak the truth aloud, but we all knew it. The Americans would come, and when they did, the horrors we had been promised since we were little girls would begin. Death was not only certain, it was necessary, or so we believed. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost its shape. Then came the sound that froze us all, the heavy, deliberate strike of boots against the earth, drawing nearer. Each step was like a drumbeat announcing the end. My chest tightened, and I pressed the grenade closer, its metal biting against my palm. My mind raced with images drilled into me since childhood. Women dragged screaming, children torn from their mothers, bodies discarded like garbage. I felt the air vanish from my lungs, as if my body itself was preparing to disappear. The others clung to each other, some covering their faces, some mouthing silent goodbyes. I do not know what gave me the strength to move, or if it was strength at all. Perhaps it was surrender. Perhaps it was the thought that if death was waiting, I would rather face it standing than crouched in a corner like a hunted animal. My legs shook as I rose, each step toward the doorway heavier than the last. The wood groaned beneath me, and the sound seemed so loud I thought the whole world must hear it. When I pushed open the door, the night air struck my face, cool and sharp, and there they were, the figures of American soldiers, shadows outlined against the faint light of the moon. My heart thrashed violently, and for a moment I thought I might faint before they could even reach me. I lifted my chin, trying to steady my breath, trying to prepare myself for the hands that would tear me apart. I whispered an apology in my mind to my mother, to the girl I once was, and braced myself. But what met me was not violence. One of the soldiers raised his hand slowly, palm open, not in threat but in caution. Another lowered his weapon, and I saw the glint of his helmet before he removed it, bowing his head slightly as if in respect. They did not rush toward me. They did not laugh, or shout, or reach for me. They stood at a distance, watching carefully, as though the space between us was sacred. My breath caught painfully in my throat, and I waited for the moment when the mask would slip, when the cruelty would begin. But it did not. Through the stillness came a voice, words I did not understand, softened by an interpreter who called out gently in my language, "You are safe. We will take you to shelter. Safe." The word felt like a trick, a cruel joke. For years, we had been told, there was no such thing as safety in American hands. Yet there was no mockery in his tone, no fire in his eyes, only patience. Behind me, the other women hesitated, whispering frantically. They thought it must be a trap, a way to lure us out before the slaughter. I could not blame them. I, too, expected at any second to be grabbed, dragged, destroyed. And yet, something in the way the soldier's shoulders bent slightly forward, as if to make himself smaller, less threatening, pierced through the iron walls of fear I had carried. It was not how monsters moved. It was how men, human men, tried to show they meant no harm. My grip loosened on the grenade. For the first time since it had been pressed into my hand, I felt its weight, not as comfort, but as a burden. My chest ached, with a strange mixture of relief and confusion, my throat burning with the tears I had refused to shed. I wanted to scream at them, to demand why they were not what I had been promised, why they were not the beasts I had been trained to fear. Instead, I stood trembling, caught between the world I had known and the one unfolding before my eyes. That night, as the soldiers motioned for us to come forward, as they stepped back to give us room, I realized something terrifying. The greatest lie was not that death was preferable to capture. The greatest lie was that compassion did not exist in the hearts of our enemies. And seeing it with my own eyes was almost harder to bear than all the suffering that had come before, because it meant my entire life had been built on shadows and fear. It meant that even in the ruins of war, there was something gentler than I had ever dared to imagine. When they finally led us away from the ruined house and into the camp, I carried nothing with me but fear. I expected every step to end in betrayal, every gesture of kindness to dissolve into the nightmare I had been warned about my entire life. The camp itself seemed strange, too orderly, too calm compared to the chaos I had imagined. We were lined up, our names taken, and then, without explanation, trays of food were set before us. I stared at mine, as if it were a cruel trick. White bread, soft and unfamiliar, a can of meat opened and placed beside it, and a square of something brown that smelled sweet chocolate, they called it. The scent alone made my stomach twist with longing, but I dared not touch it. Hunger gnawed at me, sharper than any blade. Yet I sat frozen, convinced that this was how it began. With temptation, with poison dressed up as kindness. The others looked at me, their eyes wide and hollow, waiting for someone to move first. One girl reached trembling fingers toward the bread, tore off a piece, and placed it on her tongue. She chewed cautiously, then hungrily, until her tears fell freely onto the tray. My own hand lifted before I even realized it, clutching the bread. It was soft against my lips, and when I swallowed, the taste filled me with both relief and terror. Could something so simple, so good, really be given without cruelty hiding beneath it? The canned meat was salty, heavy, strange on my tongue, but I ate it quickly, afraid it would vanish. And when I bit into the piece of chocolate, sweetness flooded my mouth, so overwhelming I felt my chest tighten. I began to sob before I could stop myself, because it had been so long since I had remembered what sweetness was. But tears did not erase the suspicion. I waited for the pain to come, for poison to burn my stomach, for laughter to rise from the soldiers as we fell writhing to the ground. Nothing happened. Hours passed, and my body, instead of collapsing, felt stronger. The next day, the same food came again, and again the day after. Always bread, sometimes fruit in metal cans, always clean water that did not carry the taste of rust or rot. At first, I nibbled cautiously, still expecting the trick, but hunger wore away my resistance, and soon I was eating until I could no longer move. The strangest thing was not the abundance, though it stunned me. It was the way the soldiers behaved. They handed us the trays, without looking too long, without reaching for us, without the smirks I had seen on the faces of men who considered our bodies their right. They spoke softly, and sometimes they even stepped back after placing the food, as if to remind us we were safe to eat without fear. I kept searching their faces for cruelty, for the glint of mockery, but what I found was indifference at worst and pity at best. It was not what I had been told to expect. At night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp, the shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices, the clang of metal as supplies were moved. My fingers brushed against the blanket, and I remembered the cold weight of the grenade that had once been my only hope. Now I had bread instead of steel, chocolate instead of the promise of fire. It should have been enough to comfort me, but it unsettled me even more. What if kindness itself was the trap? What if they fattened us only to break us later? That fear clung to me like a shadow, but with each passing day, as no hand struck me, as no man forced himself upon me, the shadow grew thinner. I could see the change in the others too. Their cheeks filled out, their eyes lost some of the deadness that had haunted us for so long. One girl laughed softly when she tasted fruit from a can, whispering that it was sweeter than any festival treat she remembered from home. Another clutched her piece of bread to her chest, saying she would save it, not to eat, but to prove to herself it was real. Watching them, I felt a crack forming deep inside me, small but undeniable. I had lived so long under the weight of one certainty, that Americans were monsters. Now, with every bite of bread, every sip of clean water, that certainty weakened. It was not sudden. It was not easy. My heart still clenched each time a soldier passed near, waiting for the lie to reveal itself. But day by day, nothing happened. They gave us food, they gave us water, and then they walked away. No touch, no violation, only sustenance. It was so simple, and yet it was the most shocking thing I had ever known. And so, against my will, my faith in the old lies began to unravel. I had once thought death sweeter than capture, but now I had tasted sweetness itself, and it did not come with chains. The girl who had gripped a grenade with trembling hands was still inside me, But she was weakening, surrendering not to the Americans, but to the unbearable truth that they were not what I had been taught to fear. And that realization, quiet and relentless, broke me more deeply than any wound could. It was the first step toward a new world, though I did not yet know if I was strong enough to live in it. When the fever came, it rose through me like a tide of fire, slow at first, then crashing, stealing my strength until even breathing felt like a task. My body ached from months of hunger and infection, but this was different, deeper, and it terrified me because I knew what sickness meant in the places I had come from. Under the Japanese officers, illness was weakness, a reason to be cast aside. Medicine was reserved for the soldiers. We were left to heal or die on our own. Lying on the thin cot in the camp, I tried to hide the shivering of my hands, hoping no one would notice. But the American guards noticed everything. One morning, as sweat soaked my clothes and my vision blurred, a soldier bent down and spoke softly to me in a language I could not understand. I flinched back instinctively, but his hand did not reach for me. Instead, he gestured toward another building, and before I could resist, they were leading me to what they called the medical tent. Every step felt heavier than the last, my head swimming with dread. I remembered the stories American doctors performing experiments on Japanese women, using them like animals in a lab. My heart pounded as I crossed the threshold. My body braced for the cold touch of instruments, the cruelty hidden behind white coats. The room smelled of antiseptic, sharp and clean, nothing like the damp and rot of the comfort station. A man in a Navy uniform stood waiting, his eyes tired, but not unkind. He did not come closer. Instead, he turned and called for someone. A woman entered, a nurse, her hair tied back neatly, her face calm. She knelt beside me, speaking in slow, gentle Japanese, telling me her name was Margaret, that she was there to help. I wanted to recoil, to tell her I knew the truth of their help, but her hands were steady and cool as she touched my forehead, not prying, not forcing. She took my pulse, then covered me with a blanket that smelled of soap and sunlight. The doctor approached only after she nodded, and even then, he kept his distance, asking through the nurse if it was all right to examine me. No one had ever asked me permission before. I had been touched, taken, used, but never asked. Something in me cracked at the sound of that question. I nodded because I was too weak to speak. They cleaned my wounds, changed the bandages, gave me medicine in small cups. Each movement was careful, as if they feared breaking me. The contrast to what I had known was unbearable. Under the Japanese army, we had been given nothing. No treatment, no tenderness. Infections festered until they became part of our bodies. Fevers burned through us without relief. Here, strangers offered pills and powders, cool water, and soft words. The doctor's eyes held no hunger, no contempt, only a kind of clinical sadness. It was disorienting, like standing in sunlight after living underground. The first night in the medical tent, I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of voices beyond the canvas walls. The fever began to break, sweat soaking my skin, but instead of the familiar emptiness of neglect, there was the steady presence of the nurse, sitting nearby with a lantern. She offered me sips of broth, wiped my face with a damp cloth, and hummed a tune I didn't recognize. Tears filled my eyes without warning. I turned my face away, ashamed, but she did not seem surprised. She simply waited, as if she understood that the sickness inside me was larger than the fever. On the third day, I woke to find color in the world again. My hands no longer trembled when I tried to sit up. A tray of food sat on the table beside me. Bread, fruit, and something warm that smelled of herbs. The nurse smiled faintly when she saw me looking. "Eat," she said softly. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed in my mind like a foreign song. I had not felt safe in years, perhaps not ever. I ate slowly, each bite a small act of disbelief. Lying there, stronger with each hour, my mind began to turn in circles. All my life, I had been told who the monsters were, told to fear their hands and their eyes. Yet here I was, healed by the people I had been taught to hate, treated like a person when my own country had treated me like a tool. The question rose unbidden, bitter and hot. Who were the real demons? Who had truly stripped us of our humanity? The answer was not as simple as the posters and the slogans had promised. I watched the doctor move about the tent, his hands gloved, his gestures efficient but never rough. He handed instruments to the nurse with care, spoke quietly to her, and when his gaze met mine, it was steady and clean, not searching for power. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first glimmer of understanding that the world was not made only of lies. The chains around my thoughts loosened, just a little, as I began to see that kindness could come from the place I had been taught to fear most. When I left the medical tent days later, the air outside felt lighter and my steps steadier. But I was not the same girl who had entered trembling with fever. A new unease had taken root, not fear of the Americans, but fear of the truth. Because if the enemy I had been taught to dread could treat me as human, then everything I had endured, everything I had believed, had been built on a lie so vast it swallowed my childhood whole. That thought stayed with me like a second heartbeat, whispering its question into every quiet moment. Who truly saw me as a person, and who had only ever seen me as a weapon? And as I walked back to the barracks, the sun spilling across the camp, I felt the old world cracking, one small fissure at a time. The days after my fever broke were filled with small, quiet moments that seemed ordinary to the women around me but felt like earthquakes inside my chest. I no longer shook with fear each time I saw the Americans pass by, though the old instinct still lingered like a shadow. Instead, I began to listen. There were women among them, soldiers in neat uniforms, carrying themselves with a confidence I had never seen in my own country. They spoke to us through interpreters or in halting Japanese, their voices steady, their faces calm. One of them, a woman named Ellen, often stayed near the tent where I rested. She told stories, not in the harsh tone of propaganda, but with the softness of someone sharing fragments of her life. She spoke of schools where girls studied side by side with boys, of women who could vote, of jobs and choices that belonged not to a family or a nation, but to the woman herself. At first, I thought I had misheard. A woman who could choose her path, who could hold her own money, her own name. It sounded like a fantasy told to comfort children before sleep. But Ellen repeated it patiently, as though she knew how impossible it was for us to believe. She spoke of her mother who had worked as a teacher, of sisters who dreamed of becoming doctors, of a country where women's voices could shape the world. I lay silent, my breath catching in my throat, because every word she spoke tore a seam in the fabric of what I had been taught. I remembered the lessons drilled into me since I was a girl, that women existed to serve, to obey, to sacrifice for emperor and family. I remembered the officers reminding us that our bodies were not our own, that they belonged first to the empire and then to the men who defended it. Even in my darkest hours, I had never questioned those truths, because they had been given to me as unshakable law. But now, hearing Ellen describe a life where women had choices, where they were seen as more than vessels for duty or pleasure, I felt something break inside me. It was a shattering, but not of despair. It was the sound of old chains snapping one by one. The shock was not only in her words, but in the realization of the lies I had swallowed. We had been told Americans were beasts, without honor, without humanity. Yet here was a woman in uniform, speaking gently, sharing food, asking questions about my childhood, as though it mattered. We had been told the enemy would strip us of dignity, but instead they offered it back in pieces through medicine, through bread, through simple conversations that treated us as equals. I began to see the enormity of the deception that had shaped my life. The monster had been the voice that convinced me to hate, to fear, to surrender myself to despair. It was not an easy revelation. At night I lay awake, clutching the blanket around me, my mind in turmoil. I thought of my village, of the neighbors who had sent their children off with knives hidden in their sleeves, convinced that honor lay in blood. I thought of my father signing the papers that delivered me into bondage, believing he was serving a greater cause. I thought of my mother's tears as she told me to endure. Were they too victims of this lie? Or had they believed it willingly? My chest ached with the weight of questions I could not answer. One afternoon, Ellen placed a book in my lap. It was worn, its cover faded, but inside were pictures of women smiling in classrooms, standing proudly in front of buildings I could not name. She pointed at one photograph of a woman at a desk, pen in hand, and said, "Teacher." I stared at that face for a long time. The woman's eyes held certainty, not submission. It was the look of someone who knew her worth. A hot sting rose in my eyes, because I had never seen such an expression on the women I grew up with. I had never dared to imagine it for myself. The collapse of my old faith was painful, like peeling away my own skin. I felt betrayed, hollowed out, furious that I had given so many years to fear and obedience. Yet beneath that pain was something I had not felt in as long as I could remember hope. A tiny, flickering light that perhaps the world was not destined to be only suffering and silence. Perhaps there was a place where a woman could walk unafraid, where she could hold her own future in her hands. I did not know then what that hope would become, whether it would survive once I returned to the ruins of my homeland. But in that camp, with bread in my stomach and warmth in my body, I allowed myself to imagine it. For the first time, I pictured a tomorrow not written by fear, but by choice. The realization was fragile, frightening even, because it meant stepping into a life I had never been prepared for. Yet I clung to it, because once the lie was broken, I could no longer live inside it. The world I had believed in was gone, crumbled into dust by the quiet kindness of those I had been told were demons. In its place stood an uncertain horizon, full of questions, full of pain, but also full of possibility. And as I sat there listening to Ellen's stories, tears blurring the photographs before me, I whispered a promise to myself. I would not forget the lies, but I would also not turn away from the truth. Even in my brokenness, I would carry this fragile hope forward. It was the first gift of freedom I had ever known. When the war finally ended, the sky did not break open with joy as I had once imagined. It was quiet, almost unbearably so, like a silence that pressed against my chest. Word of surrender spread through the camp, and though some cried in relief, I felt my body stiffen with a different kind of fear. The war had stolen my childhood, my body, my voice, but the thought of returning to Japan filled me with dread. I did not fear bombs or soldiers anymore. I feared the eyes of my neighbors, the whispers of my family, the cruel judgment of a society that would rather see me as ruined than as a survivor. I lay awake that night staring at the canvas roof above me, listening to the murmurs of the other women. Some spoke of home, others of parents they hoped were still alive, but I remained silent. I knew what awaited us back there. Not honor, not welcome, but shame. I could already imagine the way their stares would pierce me, as though I carried filth that could not be washed away. That fear clung to me more tightly than any uniformed guard ever had. And yet, beneath that fear, something else pulsed in me, a truth I could not let go of. The Americans had not done what I had been told to dread. They had not touched me, had not mocked me, had not stripped me of the last fragments of dignity I carried. They had given me bread, medicine, and moments of kindness that had cracked open the lies of my childhood. That truth, as fragile as it was, had become a seed inside me. I began to write. At first it was only in fragments, scribbles on scraps of paper given by a sympathetic nurse, a word, a sentence, a memory I could not carry in silence. I wrote about the night in the ruined house, the sound of boots on the earth, the way my fingers ached around the grenade. I wrote about the first piece of chocolate melting on my tongue, about the nurse who wiped the sweat from my forehead when fever nearly consumed me. I wrote about the stories told by women soldiers who spoke of freedom, of choices I had never known existed. Each line I carved onto the page felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. If I could not control what others would think of me when I returned, at least I could leave behind a record that said, this was the truth. When we were finally repatriated, I carried that bundle of pages with me, hidden beneath my clothing. My feet touched Japanese soil again, but I no longer felt like the girl who had been taken away. I was heavier with pain, yes, but also heavier with knowledge. The stares came. just as I had feared. Some called us traitors. Others avoided our eyes altogether. My family did not know how to hold me, and I did not know how to let them. Yet when I opened my journal late at night, I remembered that I was not only their daughter or their shame, I was a witness. Years passed, and though the world moved forward, the scars did not fade, but neither did my words. I continued to write, filling notebook after notebook, even when my hands trembled with age. I began to share the story with those who would listen, with students, with neighbors, with anyone willing to hear. Not the propaganda, not the official history, but the lived truth. Some turned away, unable to face what had been done. But others listened, their eyes heavy with sorrow, and in those moments, I felt the weight inside me grow lighter. I did not become a teacher of children or a leader of men. I became something quieter, yet just as necessary, a keeper of memory. My story was not just my own. It was the story of thousands who could not speak, who had died nameless or lived in silence. By telling it, I carried them with me, and I defied the lie that had stolen so much of our lives. Looking back now, I can still see that terrified girl in the farmhouse, clutching her grenade, convinced that death was the only path left. She feels like a ghost to me, yet she is also my beginning. Without her fear, there would be no measure for my strength. Without her despair, there would be no depth to my hope. I became a witness not because I was brave, but because I survived long enough to see that the truth, however painful, is stronger than the chains of deception. I know the world does not always learn quickly. Lies take root easily, and hatred often grows faster than compassion. But I also know this: the memory of bread given freely, of medicine offered gently, of respect shown when I least expected it, will never leave me. These memories became my proof that humanity, even in war, can shine through. And if my words can carry that truth into the hearts of others, then perhaps the lie will not live forever. From a girl silenced by fear, I became a voice. From a prisoner of propaganda, I became a witness to its collapse. My body may bear scars, but my story bears light. And that, I have come to believe, is how even the smallest act of kindness can undo the deepest darkness. Through Aiko's journey, we have walked from shadows into light, from the grip of lies into the fragile truth of humanity. We saw how a young girl, broken by war and indoctrination, prepared herself for death. Rather than face the enemy she was taught to fear, only to discover compassion where she expected cruelty, bread where she expected starvation, and medicine where she expected torment. Each step she took unraveled the deception of an empire and revealed the most powerful truth of all: that kindness can shatter even the darkest chains of propaganda. Her story is not just about survival, but about transformation, about how a frightened girl became a witness to history and how her words outlived the silence forced upon her. But what does this mean for us today? In a world still full of voices that twist truth and spread fear, Aiko's testimony reminds us that courage begins with questioning, with daring to see what lies beyond the story we are told. It asks us to reflect: who are we believing, and who is silenced in the process? Now I turn to you. If you were in Aiko's place, abandoned, armed only with fear, and suddenly shown compassion by those you thought were demons, what would you have done? Would you trust, or would you cling to the lie? Share your thoughts below, because your perspective keeps these stories alive. And stay with us, because Aiko's journey is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of forgotten voices. In the next chapter, we'll uncover another story that history tried to bury, one that may challenge you even more deeply. Don't miss it.